My name's Graeme and welcome to 2026 Lead Listeners. From municipal elections to the FIFA World Cup, it is going to be a banger of a year, and we'll be with you telling our country's most critical stories every step of the way. For our very first edition of Season 2 of The Lead, Bafana Bafana bows out of the Africa Cup of Nations after failing to capitalise on early attacks against the Cameroonians in the knockout stages. We'll hit the locker room with News24 Sport journalist Tashreeq Vardien next.
We have talent in abundance, Graeme. The most important thing is for us to be able to be playing these important top nations. And we have nothing against the likes of Angola, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Eswatini. I just feel that it's more than enough time now for us to jump that ship and start playing tougher opponents, because that's the only way we're going to learn. That's the only way we're going to improve.
Later in our trending topic, the SAPS scores several arrests these holidays, seizing explosives in the process. And finally, the SABC's very first run of television broadcasts started on this day in South African history, heard at the end of the show.
To know when the next episode drops, hit the like, follow and subscribe buttons on our YouTube, Spotify and Apple Podcast channels.
My name's Graeme, this is The Lead, and this is the South African story. Happy 2026! Sports journalist Tashreeq Vardien is live on the line now here in the Mother City. Tashreeq, thanks so much for joining us on our very first edition of The Lead on News24 in 2026. How are you doing?
How's it, Graeme? I'm fantastic, man. It's always a pleasure to be on your show, even though I have not made many appearances. So thank you for inviting me back again. But it's 2026, we're in the jolly spirit, South African December and January, it's our time to shine, as we say in South Africa.
Absolutely, and we'll have you plenty more on the show in the near future. It's going to be a bumper year. We're into Season 2 of the podcast now. But I thought let's look back at Bafana's journey throughout the AFCON tournament thus far. And in actual fact, take the last 5 games, and that will, of course, include the pre-tournament friendly, which we won against Ghana 1-0. I just want us to sort of consider how well Bafana had done, where our sort of weaknesses emerged. And it's quite clear that the last 5 games, we won 3, we lost 2. And in those 2 games, against Egypt, for example, we could have won that game. And then obviously against Cameroon, a much, obviously as well as a quite stronger side. We also had our chances quite early on and we failed to capitalize on those. So let's go through that Ghana game first. What stood out for you as we were sort of heading towards the AFCON tournament?
Yeah, so if we were to think back to that Ghana game specifically, a couple of days before, week before the Africa Cup of Nations started, what particularly stood out for me in that game is that despite the many changes Hugo Broos made in that particular match, as he was trying to figure out, or at least he knew what his starting 11 looks like. He gave a couple of fringe players minutes in the legs just to keep them by heading into the tournament. And despite it being against a Ghanaian team that did not have any of their strongest players, Bafana wilted on, put in a half-decent performance. But what was very important is that they got the win by a fantastic goal from Sipho Mbule, who's become sort of this figure in that role that Themba Zwane sort of just made famous under the Hugo Broos regime.
Yeah,
Sipho Mbule has now come in and, performed really well, and he scored a stunning goal. And it gave Bafana that sort of, how could I say, confidence heading into a tournament. Prior to that, we already know what happened, because that was the Bafana camp. Prior to we already know what happened with Mbokazi coming late. Hugo Broos's comments, that reverberated around the nation. And that sort of, gave Bafana a nervy start to an already difficult tournament. But they jumped over that broom and eventually got over it. But somewhere along the line, I just feel like that sort of, ill discipline from Mbokazi arriving late to the camp perhaps filtered over into Broos. And he rightly so was very frustrated and angry. But obviously the comments that came out of that was not acceptable at all from any head coach, let alone a human being. So he apologized and we moved forward. And obviously, heading into the tournament, we eventually, meet a very strong Angola side.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's Lyle Foster emerging as what would be a very strong key player for Bafana throughout the tournament. And it was in never doubt that, South Africa would clinch a win here. It was almost expected, if you will, against Angola. And yeah, we emerged with a 2-1 victory. What stood out for you?
That's the thing about South Africans when it comes to sport in general. We have this fixation about having high expectations. And nonetheless, it's very important to have expectations. But when it came to Bafana Bafana, our expectations were so high because we exceeded expectations at the 2024 tournament, where we ended with a bronze medal. So now, obviously, from that tournament, once they exited that tournament, Bafana Bafana went on to a 27-match unbeaten run, which is insane, until they lost to Egypt. So if we think about this Angola game, there's expectations. Okay, it's Angola. We have to win this game. And they crossed the line with a half-decent performances. But what stood out for me in that match is that the Achilles heel, which was this defensive back four that hardly played any football with one another in the past year or so, having to rely on one another. Because if you think about it, 2 years ago, Bafana Bafana, Hugo Bruce had a centre-back pairing, just Mamelodi Sundowns players. And now you're bringing in 4 players that is in the back four that hardly play any time at club level with each other, let alone at national level. You didn't have that enough time to build a strong defensive block. I mean, you have Bokazi there, you have Ngazana, you have Aubrey Modiba, you have Kulili Somodao. These 4 players that plays for different clubs. And even though there was Bafana across the line with 2 goals to Angola's 1, that's what really stood out for me in that particular match. But what was so important is that, once again, as they showed against Ghana, the grit, the fight, stood tall amongst everything else, including performances, and which stood us good before that dreaded Egypt match, which we eventually saw Bafana put in a good performance there.
Yeah, and I mean, Egypt was always going to be the real early test in the AFCON run thus far. And yeah, it comes down to a very controversial penalty, Tashreeq, that ultimately divides us in the group stages on the log, leaving us to be relegated to that B spot on the particular log. And here's Mo Salah putting that penalty away against us, nogals with a red card. Your thoughts on what was probably our most controversial game thus far?
That penalty that Mo Salah got, that should not have stood. For people that don't understand, obviously, these football terms, I mean, a hand gets in the eye, a hand gets in the chest, players sort of make a meal of it. But at the same time, when those things do happen, it's not necessarily something that players do on purpose. Yes, we understand football is a physical sport, but these kinds of things happen. And when those kinds of things happen in a football match, it's usually a drop ball. What was funny, very funny, I mean, and heartbreaking even in today, if we look back, is that, the incident went to a video assistant referee, VAR, the famous technology that we either love or we loathe if it's going in our favor. Unfortunately, at that particular moment, we, as South Africans, we hated it with all our might, because such an incident should never, ever, ever, ever in the rule book have gone to a review firstly, and to a penalty. Which was even more funny is that when something goes for a review, there's 2 instances. Once the referee goes to the screen, which is only the last resort, then you know that they want the referee to look at the incident. That's the point number 1. The second point is obviously Yes, Egypt got a red card, and I rightly believe that was a red card because there was 2 yellow card offences that player did, and the second yellow card offence was actually brutal, which he basically hammered the guy's foot. No regard. That was the correct decision. The third contentious decision that was made is that the penalty that Bafana Bafana did not get in their favour, which, if you think about it, was a handball. It was in the penalty. It was in the penalty area. Unfortunately, according to some confusing rules, which you don't know what's gonna be a handball these days, because it was a leaping arm and the player was trying to balance himself. The referee agreed that it was no penalty. That is a decision that, is contentious, not only in African football, but football all over. We don't know what rules is going to be implemented, but Hugo Broos obviously had a clash of words with the media after that.
Yeah.
Quite angry, saying that he didn't understand why it was not given.
Yeah, and then obviously that became the decider. We could have been the top spot, one could argue, in that particular quite difficult group, let's just be honest, especially for Bafana standards, as we were trying to build a team and pushing, the envelope, as it were. Then it came down to our neighbours, Zimbabwe, the Warriors. There is this sort of quite hush rivalry and been happening for years and years now between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And in our last, a couple of run of games, there's been 7 wins for Zimbabwe over Bafana Bafana, so it's nothing to scoff at. There certainly weren't going to be pushovers coming into this particular match. We needed to win it in order to be the second in that particular group. And they lived up to the hype. They gave us a run for their money, didn't they?
Yeah, as they always do. I call them the noisy neighbours when it comes to these football matches, because they're always out to disrupt Bafana Bafana's runs, the way Bafana Bafana plays. And they showed once again that there's a reason that the nickname is called the Warriors. But Bafana Bafana stood tall once again. And this is the match where I look back and I think to myself, yeah, there are some very teething issues in this Bafana Bafana defense. Silly errors that was made, but also at the same time, Bafana should have scored at least 5 to 6 goals in that game. They were not clinical enough. It's very important for them now to go look back at these couple of matches and think back as to where they went wrong. The other part of this is that for every mistake, for every risk that they took in how they wanted to play is a learning curve for Bafana Bafana heading into, obviously, the World Cup later this year. As we think about the current tournament and what has happened for Bafana Bafana, what stood out in this match is that they could fight back. We know Bafana Bafana had that fighting spirit. They could play a particular way. They could play dirty. They could have that grit in the performances. They could stand tall. They can score goals. They can score important goals. They can score good goals. But it's just that defense that has been the Achilles heel throughout this tournament that came to come to bite them back. And obviously, we know what happened exactly at last night as well.
Well, let's talk about that right now. I mean, of course, this is Coach Hugo Broos's, former side. He once upon a time obviously coached Cameroon to many victories. And yeah, there were some early chances in the first half, and that Bafana just failed to capitalise on. Not necessarily shots on target as much as challenging the keeper, but definitely in the right direction. We were playing good attacking football from the early outset, but failed to capitalise. And then, we got hammered. We got punished in the second half for that. 2 goals slotted against us. We got a late, consolation goal, but not enough against a tough Cameroonian side. And we should have expected as much going into the knockouts. A bit of a sad end. And the crowd made us know it, telling us which way was the airport. And of course, Hugo Broos's comments in the run-up, trying to play psychological games. Apparently he was unhappy, and correct me if I'm wrong yet, Tashreeq, unhappy about the location of Bafana's camp in relation to the training grounds for the run-up to this particular game. He had said so in relation to the media, and there's been some sort of unhappy public sentiment in that regard, also about the hosting of the particular event on Morocco's part. So all of this didn't play in our favour, and we got punished for it in the end.
Yeah, I understand where Hugo Bruce is coming from, but I mean, if we start back from his earlier comments when he talked about obviously Morocco as host, and he felt that there's no real Africa Cup of Nations vibe here. We're speaking to a coach who is 73 years old in the song year of his long coaching career. And he's been at many tournaments, particularly obviously the one at last in 2 years ago in Ivory Coast. He's been to the one in Gabon with Cameroon. And he obviously felt a certain kind of African football vibe about an AFCON tournament, which you get. And I fully understand where he's coming from, but also at the same time, once you say something about, a nation and the vibe, and it's not gonna rub people up in the same way, especially ones coming from Morocco. Then obviously the comments about the location for this particular match in Rabat. So Bafana were about 40 to 45 minutes away from the training, from where they need to train for matches, which is not ideal. And he was not particularly he was not particularly okay with that, and his concerns. As we've come to know, that of Hugo Bruce is not someone to shy away from the truth. Something that I really respect about him. Something that I really, in the same breath, think that maybe this is the best time for you to bite your tongue. But he's not that kind of person. If he needs to get something off his chest, he duly obliges with himself in that moment, and he says how he feels. And that also didn't wrap up the Moroccan people the right way. And then obviously heading into this match, which is still fresh in my mind. Seeing this team, the team sheet firstly. So you see 5 defenders and you immediately think, oh, this guy's playing a 3-4-2-1 formation. A formation that we have not played in almost 2 years. The last time we played that formation, Graeme, was against Nigeria in the semi-final of AFCON, where we...
Sure, what a fun fact.
Which we lost on penalties. Fast forward, obviously, more than 2 years later, almost 2 years later, we play that formation again. And as you mentioned before you asked me this question, is that we played fantastic football. I can say that out the gate. The only thing that was missing was the goals. And as I've repeated myself consistently as we've been discussing, is the leaky defense. We had everything in our favor in those first, I'd say, half an hour before Cameroon scored their first goal in the 33rd minute. We had 3 very important goals. There was also another chance where the ball ended up in the back of the net from Lyle Foster, which he was offside by an inch, if not less. And the other 3 chances is that Mofokeng, which was his first match at the tournament, skied his opportunity. Same with Mbokazi, skied his opportunity. It's those, it's those big match temperament moments that you will have to have when your time comes. And unfortunately, we didn't have those BMT moments in our armor, and eventually came to bite us in the arse again, where early in the second half, Bafana fell asleep once again, and Cameroon capitalized and took a 2-goal cushion into practically the rest of the game, until Evidence Mahopa and Aubrey Modiba combined. 2 players that were on the bench, 2 players that has, significant AFCON African club football experience. They came on and they combined and scored Bafana's only goal on the night, which was in the 87th minute. Bafana literally had 8 minutes. That included stoppage time to fight back and maybe push the game for extra time. It was not to be, But in those final 8 minutes, I could not have been more proud of these players. We have a very strong squad. The most important thing is just to build on these performances right now, and stop all those leaking goals and make sure that we make our opportunities count.
Yeah, 100%. Your colleague, Njabulo Ngidi, also one of your co-football writers, has this excellent line in his latest analytical piece for News24, and I thought I'd really quote it because we can take our conversation here quickly just to wrap everything up, Tashreeq, and I'll quote the following. This AFCON disappointment should be a lesson for Bafana, who are still not a permanent member of the big boys table in African football, but are auditioning for the role. Would you agree with that sort of scathing analysis, Tashreeq, that, when it comes down to it and building up for these big tournaments, building up for the next FIFA World Cup in June this year, by the way, no longer, we have to say next year, but we should be playing much bigger foes. We should be testing ourselves against much bigger footballing nations, and not just, not to say that African sides, won't test us like Cameroon or Egypt, for example. But we should be playing against, our European counterparts a lot more as we move to these big tournaments, so that we can test our mettle a lot more. Of course, we've lost quite significantly in the past against sides like France, for example, but they're very few and far between. Your view on this particular analysis, where do you find yourself thinking as we forge ahead to the FIFA World Cup in North America?
Yeah, as always, Njabulo always just says things so eloquently with his words, and I have to agree with him. And this has been the case of, let me put it to you in this way, it's not necessarily Bafana Bafana's problem. We have to understand that Bafana Bafana falls under a flagship of the South African Football Association, similar to how the Springboks fall under South African Rugby Union. So every national team has a union. The unfortunate part for SAFA is that they've always been cash strapped. That's as simple as that. And to get these big matches, it requires quite a penny in order to travel to Europe. In order to get European teams to come here, it costs a penny as well. Hopefully, and I'm praying that obviously in these next couple of months, obviously we have a window in March, where it will hopefully allow a European team or a faster African team, maybe the likes of Algeria, Morocco, Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, those teams to come here, or for us to go there, or a top European team or a top South American team. These are the kinds of matches that Bafana Bafana should be playing. And Njabulo says it's so right, that we are still auditioning. We are at the ceiling. It's time for Bafana Bafana to eventually break through that ceiling, crush it open, and, find ourselves on a podium where we could rub shoulders with Nigeria, Cameroon, Egypt, these top African nations. And because that's the first step right now. Yes, we have one AFCON title. We've always believed that we are at the top of the podium, but we've always certainly, reached the hand, touched the podium, and then slipped. But this audition has been going on for the past 2 years. And now, hopefully in the 2026, is that it's important that we take that necessary steps. But SAFA has to come to the table. We need a president at SAFA to guide us to the glory land. It's important that we put the right and necessary steps for this thing to move right. We've seen things go right for South African rugby. We've seen things finally go right for the Proteas, both men and women. We've seen our Banyana ladies, crash through that ceiling and win, obviously, the Women's Africa Cup of Nations back in 2022, which was a fantastic and a proud moment for the nation. Later this year, they go again in March and April, trying to win the second title. There are steps to be followed. But SAFA has to do things right for South African football. They're the only ones that can actually solve this. We have talent in abundance, Graeme. The most important thing is for us to be able to be playing these important top nations. And we have nothing against the likes of Angola, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Eswatini. I just feel that it's more than enough time now for us to jump that ship and start playing tougher opponents, because that's the only way we're going to learn. That's the only way we're going to improve.
Absolutely. Hallelujah. I really do appreciate it. That's a mic drop from Tashreeq Vardien. Look out for his writings on News24 Sport over the next 12 months. 2026 going to be an absolutely busy, bumper year of note. Super excited for the FIFA World Cup. I know South Africa will do us proud. Hoping to get to the knockout stages in that particular tough tournament of note. Tashreeq, it's been a good chat. I really do appreciate the energy you bring, the analysis as well. And I'm sure we're going to have you back on the lead in no time at all. Have a good 2026.
Epic. Thank you so much, Graeme. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Trending topic.
Shifting gears now to our training topic, and National Police say more than 300 explosives have been confiscated across South Africa this festive season alone. Now, between the 29th of December and this past Sunday, some 50 suspects were arrested for carrying bombs and other destructive items up and down Mzansi. Now, according to SAPS, its Operation Shanela 2 saw more than 16,000 people in total behind bars just these holidays. Crimes related to substance abuse have been a top priority for the police, with nearly 2,000 people handcuffed for driving under the influence. Now, 135 people were taken in for murder and a whopping 181 others alone for rape. The police's spokesperson, Amanda van Wyk, says officers also secured breakthroughs with arrests in their investigations into the Athlone court shooting here in the mother city, as well as the mass murders of some 12 people in Attridgeville, Gauteng.
The operation also saw 997 suspects arrested for contravening the Immigration Act, 135 for murder, 181 for rape, 81 suspects arrested for illegal possession of firearms, 50 for the possession of explosives, and 396 for possession of dangerous weapons. The nationwide sweep also yielded significant recoveries and confiscations, which include 113 firearms recovered, including handguns, rifles, homemade weapons, and shotguns, 1,278 rounds of ammunition, 325 explosives confiscated, and 32 hijacked and stolen vehicles recovered in the past week.
Well, what say you? Is this a nonsensical clogging of our courts, or are you happy with the SAPS successes? Well, drop us your thoughts in the comments section below.
And finally,
ending off now with On This Day in South African history. That's the 5th of January 1976. Well, on this very day, the South African Broadcasting Corporation began regular daily television broadcasts, marking the very first time that TV was finally available in South Africa. This came now after 7 months of trial transmissions during 1975, making South Africa one of the last countries globally to introduce TV in households. Now, the service was officially opened then by Prime Minister John Vorster, who had warned in his launch speech against quote-unquote slanted news and unbalanced presentations, reflecting the National Party government's long-standing suspicion that TV could be a potential subversive medium. Now, for years, the apartheid state had resisted this, fearing that TV would expose South Africans to more liberal ideas. And early SABC TV was tightly controlled. Ironically, though, by the late 1970s and throughout the 80s, the National Party increasingly used the SABC as a powerful propaganda tool, and news coverage echoed government talking points. It downplayed any internal resistance and framed liberation movements as security threats. The broadcaster became central, in fact, to the state's quote-unquote total strategy against what it described as a revolutionary onslaught. Well, that's On This Day in South African history, the 5th of January 1976. That's courtesy of the online medium South African History Online. Thanks so much for choosing The Lead as your choice news podcast this festive season, with the show firmly climbing the Apple charts, and we're about to hit 1 million total listens across the board. If you'd like to engage us about anything you've heard in this particular edition, send us your thoughts and opinions to thelead@24.com. Or you can simply drop us a comment below on any of the platforms you're listening to us right now. Now, to be reminded of each episode, simply just hit the like, follow, and subscribe buttons on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and Iono. Until next time, my name's Graeme Robelheimer, and so long as there's trusted news first, we'll always have the lead on News 24.